I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous. And this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, "Dear Mr. Pye, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerians said, and a male person from elsewhere, as I also contend." He goes on to say, "What the evolutionists do is find certain genes which look very similar between man and ape, then they make a tree of descent while ignoring those huge impassable abysses of difference elsewhere. Also, by certain methods of DNA dating, one can tell that numerous genes have been recently added to the human genome. If workers in my field were to say such things openly, we would be ostracized, as I also contend, and forced to live in a tent. Any work along these lines would be rejected without any form of appeal. So what can we do? Sincerely, DNA Deep Throat." The Sumerians are the first great culture that we know to come out of the Stone Age. At around 6,000 years ago, they appear full-blown, everything. Over 100 of the first that we attribute to a high culture the Sumerians produced. Now, logic would tell you, and certainly the Darwinian paradigm of simplicity leading to ever more complexity would tell you that the first culture out of the Stone Age is going to come crawling out of the caves on bloody hands and knees. Are they not? But no, these guys come sailing out and start building beautiful cities and have education and law and everything. They had the first great cities, the first great city centers, the first high-rise buildings, the first walls, the first roads, the first wheeled vehicles, the first ocean-going vessels, geniuses with water, first agriculture, first animal husbandry, first court systems, first literature. You name it, they had it. Well, everything except cable TV, maybe. I mean, they had it. They were great. They were a fantastic culture. And the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans come from their culture. Those cultures developed from what passes down from the Sumerians, or at least out from the Sumerians, I believe. What's the proof of that? Is there any proof that any ancient advanced civilization was ever on Earth at any point in the dim or distant past? Yes, yes. The megalithic structures out there, the pyramids, Tiwanaku, Baalbek, Teotihuacan, Stonehenge, you name it. A couple of dozen of them. All of those are impossible for human beings to recreate today. And yet we are told in another one of these great fantasies that they were somehow created by people in ancient times, ancient Egyptians or ancient Sumerians or anybody. Somehow or other they did it. And it's just absolute malarkey. Impossible. Egyptian scholars tried to prove it by getting down in with some pink granite here and wailing away with some stones for a few hours and tore their hands up and walked out of there saying, well, we couldn't make much of a dent in it, but boy, those old folks, they sure had a lot of time on their hands, and somehow they figured out a way to do it. Wouldn't give an inch after this. Wouldn't give an inch. It's ridiculous. Now, here's the stone they're working on. Some of you may have seen this. This is an ancient 1,170-ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan quarry. A crack rendered the stone unusable. It's pink granite. They were making it into an obelisk. Okay, it's about 100 feet long. It's about 12 feet wide, 12 feet deep on the side. Imagine the Washington Monument just squared off. And it's pretty much done. But now let's go ahead and say they didn't finish it and they finished it. These primitive people now who managed somehow to do this. They finished it. It's ready to go. The hole, by the way, is about 15 feet deep. That's the top of it up there. But still, what's the first thing they've got to do? Somebody's got to draw straw to get down there with his hatchet and cut it loose from the bottom. Now, who's going to do that with 1,100 tons sitting on top of him? We could not get our best diamond-tipped blades to cut through underneath this thing. The weight would stop the blade. We could not. The operative word here is impossible. We could not get this out of here. And yet they did it time and time and time again. To lift it out, just if we somehow cut it loose, we would have to take a dozen of our largest movable cranes to wring that hole just to get it up. It's absolutely impossible. This one stone proves that none of the megaliths were made by those people in that era. And this, again, is not the biggest one. Baalbek twice that big. Okay? So, one of the many things they had at first was writing. Now, this is what we're all taught. We're taught nothing about the Sumerians except that they invented writing. Again, they appear, boop, invent writing, boop, disappear, and that's it. History forgets about them. You never hear what they wrote. You never hear what they wrote. And you never hear how sophisticated they were because, again, it doesn't fit that paradigm. It's easier to just start with the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans and move on from there. Okay? What they had to say in their writings, their writing, by the way, was cuneiform, very sophisticated math-based writing. And by the way, their mathematical system, called sexagesimal, based on the number 60, is better than ours for using very small numbers and very large numbers. It starts with cylinder seals. And I just want you to see what a cylinder seal is. There are about 5,000 of these that we have. There were the printing press. It was just a thing that would roll out on the clay to leave little pictures like this. Now, when they had a story to tell, they told it in the tablets. But when they had an event that everybody would know the event, the point is, notice the fine detail in the best of the cylinder seals, and then realize that these are basically 2 to 3 inches high. They're like big spools of thread. Made out of precious and semi-precious stone, carved in a circular format so that they roll out flat and three-dimensionally. Now, when asked how this was done, science says, well, they could only have bored little holes into the rock and then abraded them out like they, to the degree that they wanted. Well, the sand would be bigger than the holes you need to do this. Some of this work anyway. There's just no way. Lasers, this is not even an inch square here. Lasers would have a hard time doing this if they could do it. Nobody knows how they did this. They're just pulling one out of the hat on you, among other things. But in their writings, most of it is like these little hand things where it's just bills of lading. I sell you this, I'm buying that from you. It's like our paperwork. But they have a lot of them, about 5,000 of the 100,000 or more that we have, that have to do with stories of their cosmology, their cosmogony, their history, where we came from, how the solar system formed and all that. And that's what we're going to go over, what they had to say. Where did it come from? Well, originally, when these things were being translated in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the translators would read what they'd have to say, it was like, oh, come on, forget about it. Put them in the myth. These are myths. They have to be myth. It can't be true. And they put it in the myth pile, which Alan was talking about, myth. So, how does the first culture get a myth? Who hands it to them? Good question. Why didn't anybody else think of that? So, he assumes it has to be a history. They have to be telling a history, which then later gets distorted perhaps as myth by later cultures, but the first one's got to be a history. Okay? We're going to go over what the Sumerians had to say, boiled down. All right, what we're told is that the Anunnaki came to Earth for this, gold, mining gold. And that originally, the story is, they landed in ancient Sumer, but not 6,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, 430,000 approximately to be exact. 400,000 years ago, they land in modern-day Iraq, and they set up shop in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and they call their home away from home, their home away from Nibiru, the Eden, the Tigris River Valley. That is where it was. That is where Eden was, according to them, and it comes down in the Bible as such. So they set up camp, and they placer mined the gold out of those rivers. What do they need gold for? They needed to repair their atmosphere. In their rise to high technology, they had damaged that big, 3 times the size of Earth atmosphere, the same exact way we're damaging ours in our rise to high technology, and they ultimately had to repair it with very fine particulates of gold, like talcum powder, blown up into the stratosphere above it so it would ride above there and act as a reflector and an insulator from cosmic rays, which is, you see that on the masks of astronauts and in the capsule and all that. Gold is a wonderful stopper of cosmic rays. So that's what they had to repair it with. It's what we will have to repair it with. We'll have to do exactly the same thing when the day comes for us to have to face up to what we're doing to our planet. Okay? So, they came, they placer mined out of the river, and all that is you put a tray in the water, you let the water sweep over, the water drops the gold into these cloth. Every few weeks you pick it up, and it's real easy. It's the way we do it now when we have the opportunity. But you tap out any stream system, ultimately, and they did. After about 150,000 years, they had tapped it out. And so they decided they were going to split themselves up and go where the mother lode of gold was on the planet Earth, which is what it is today, southern Africa. So they divided themselves into the upper world, which remained the Eden, and the Abzu, which was the lower world, and you didn't want to go to the lower world because you had to get in the holes and dig the gold. And they didn't like it. So the Anunnaki revolted. They said, we don't want to do this. We want a slave to do this work for us. Plus, it was a hardship duty, mostly men. Why don't you make us some women while you're at it? So that's what they did. They decided to use the creatures of Earth, which would be the hominoids, and I say it would have been the Almas, the likeliest candidate. They took the creatures of Earth to get some of their genetic material to make the new slave better adapted physically to the planet than they were, but the slave would for the most part be like themselves. We shall make the Adamu, A-D-A-M-U, which comes down as Adam, and we shall make the Adamu in our own image after our own likeness, which comes down word for word. And that is what they did. They made their slave inferior models of themselves. That's us, folks. That's us. We're really inferior models of the Anunnaki. And as you saw in the cylinder seal, we look like them. We look like, in their own image, after their own likeness. In all of the cylinder seals, we look just like them. We don't have the horns on our headgear. That's about it. We are them. That's why we're not adapted to this planet. That's why we're so obviously not a part of this planet. We have their bones. We don't have primate bones. We have their muscles. We don't have primate muscles. We have their skin. We don't have primate skin. We have their body pattern, their hair patterns on their body is ours. We have thickest on our front, thinnest on our back. Primates have thick on the back, thin on the front. We have their eyes, their poor night vision eyes. We have their foreheads. We have their brains. That's the key to this. We have their brains. That's why we're not like anything else on this planet. We are them. We are genetically engineered copies of them. Let's take a look at how that was done. Human body contains 100 trillion cells. There's a nucleus inside each human cell except red blood cells. Each nucleus contains 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. One chromosome of every pair is from each parent. The chromosomes are filled with tightly coiled strands of DNA. Genes are segments of DNA that contain instructions to make proteins, the building blocks of life. This is where genetic engineering takes place. Now, we're going to go over it lightly, but it's very important. I want you to understand these things that I'm going to tell you now. Don't worry about the details and how they do it. This is what they do. They can open up a cell, our genetic engineers can, our geneticists can. We can open up a cell, open up the nucleus, pull out strands of DNA, and in that strand, 98% of it will be what's called junk DNA. We don't know what it does. If it has a function, we don't know what it is. 2% will be what are called, prosaically enough, the working segments. They work. They do what they're supposed to do. They make the proteins. Now, if you cut in the junk above a working segment and in the junk below and remove it and have done the same with another strand of DNA over here, you can move anything into anything else. It can be animal into plant, plant into animal, fish into fowl. It does not matter because all living things at the most fundamental level are exactly alike. Understand that. We're all made of the same 4 base pairs, the same 20 amino acids. Everything is the same at the most basic level. It's like it's pop beads that are interchangeable. It is almost as if somebody designed it that way so they could just mix and match the parts and make anything they wanted. Isn't it? Something to think about. Okay, but the problem with it from an engineering standpoint is this. You're not cutting with a blade. These are not precise cuts. The blade would have to be a few molecules thick. You're cutting with chemicals. Chemicals. Now, the chemicals can cut pretty accurately, but mistakes are going to happen. Something's going to ooze out where it doesn't belong. Something's going to splash over it where it doesn't belong. Mistakes are going to happen. Inevitable. We know that. We make mistakes all the time. Another problem with genetic engineering is you don't know what you're going to get when you do this. You can't predict. You have to decide what you're going to do. You have to do it. You have to let it express, which is live, and see what you get, and then use that to determine what you do the next time. And of course, the great fear in genetic engineering is somebody's going to make a mistake and create the Andromeda strain that's going to kill us all. A legitimate concern. Although everybody's very careful, and I'm not too worried about it. But mistakes do happen because all of this is so incredibly microscopic. It's out of the nucleus of your cells. Imagine how microscopic it is. But don't try to figure it out. It's really complex. But they do it. Okay. Understand that. Now, with that in mind, let's look at some of the proofs that I say indicate very clearly that we are, in fact, what the Sumerians say, a genetically engineered species by the Anunnaki. Okay, here we go. The cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface region of a brain that is most strongly linked to intelligence. It's the stained part out here. If you peel that off of the brain of a rat, it will cover a postage stamp. Peel it off of a monkey, it'll cover a postcard. Peel it off a chimp, it'll cover a sheet of typing paper. Peel it off of us, and it'll cover 4 sheets of typing paper. Now, you can see this is a transition. This is clearly a transformation. Now, there's some weird things about it. These guys are using all they've got. All they've got. We're using 1/2 of one page in a very different way than they are using what they have. 1/2 of one page. How do we know? We all know. We use about 10% of our brains. We know that from the studies done with idiot savants. You know that. And we know there are thousands of miles of neural network in our heads not being used. We don't know why. We don't know why. I'll tell you why. We shall make the atom who's strong but not too strong, smart but not too smart. They sealed it off genetically at the 10% mark or wherever it is. We don't know exactly where it is. But wherever it is, they sealed us off. You don't want your slave to be anywhere near as smart as you. You, in fact, want your slave to be so decidedly inferior to you that you never have to worry about treating it like a slave. So they engineered us to be really clever to ourselves, But for them, we were smart enough to talk, take instructions, act with a little bit of ingenuity and self-reliance. They could turn things over to us and kind of let us take over and do it. They gave us just enough to be wonderful in our own eyes, but be pond scum relative to them. It's what they did. So, it's pretty clear in as much as that, and now understand with the idiot savants, for those of you that don't know the proof about this, idiot savants get some beam of light in the damage to the good 10. They get some beam of light and it will strike somewhere in the other 90%. You all saw Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, remember? Well, they get it in math, they get it in music, they get it in sculpture, art, whatever, wherever it strikes. Now, if there's just one, we could say, well, that's a freak of nature. But we've had lots of them, lots of them. So we know that all of this is out there. It's in our heads. We just can't access it. We just can't use it. But if it wasn't in our heads, it wouldn't be in their heads. So we know that it happened. They have no idea how. Well, I say that the Anunnaki did it deliberately, and that makes sense to me. Okay, mitochondrial DNA, late 1980s, you might remember this. In humans, over 99.99% of a cell's DNA is packed into the cell nucleus, with a small amount occurring outside the nucleus in small structures called mitochondria. That's these babies right here. They're about 16,000 base pairs long. Now, when you have a mixing and a mating, the DNA in the nucleus mixes. But with the mitochondrial DNA, it does not. Sperm doesn't have mitochondrial, eggs do. And so females pass it down intact generation after generation. Well, when this was figured out in the 70s, boy, the botanist and the geneticist said, great, now we can go and find out if the split from the common ancestor was closer to 8 million years or closer to 5 million years. Remember that? We're going to now pin it down. It's going to be one or the other. We're going to figure it out. So they went out and they took the mitochondrial DNA of women all around the world, every race, every creed, every culture, every country, and they brought them back to the lab and they started working on them. And when the answers came in the late 1980s, it was not 8 million years ago. It wasn't 5 million years ago. It was way the heck down to 200 to 250,000 years ago, and that's all. We're starting with, just as an example, the megalithic walls at Saxe-Mont. If I was standing right here, my head would be about where yours too would be about where that white spot is. I wish I had a shot of with somebody there, but these are huge in the mountains of Peru. But you have them in Tiahuanaco in Bolivia. You have them in Baalbek in Lebanon. 2,000 tons! 2,000 tons in Baalbek in Lebanon. These are just hundreds of tons. But it's just impossible for human beings to do this. The tolerances are just incredible when you get there. You reach your hand, sometimes earthquakes have spread some of the rocks, you reach your hand in there, it feels like a baby's bottom, perfectly smooth. We can't do that. The one that everybody looks at is the pyramids. Now, you need to know two numbers for the Giza Plateau. 100 years, this is what they insist, the Egyptologists insist that the three pyramids and the Sphinx were all built within 100 years. The lifetimes of three pharaohs. And 6 million stones conservatively. If you go by just the counts of the layers and you work it out, people have done that. It's between 6 and 7 million stones, they estimate. If you go the lowball figure, 6 million stones, let's go with those two numbers. 100 years, 6 million stones. 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, every minute of every day for those 100 years to make this happen according to the Egyptologist schedule. Every 8.5 minutes a stone has to go into place. Night and day. Night and day. It is so absurd, it is so incredibly absurd, I can't believe that people just sit there and go to conferences like this, and every one of them in the room has got a PhD after his name, and they sit there and say, wow, okay, cool. Stupid. That's what I say. Just keep those two numbers in mind. 100 years, 6 million stones, ridiculous. Look at this. The Great Pyramids used to be covered with limestone, polished limestone. Shining so perfectly, fit together so perfectly, it glared in the sun for 20, 25 miles on a bright day. Look at the precision. You can't get the tip of a knife blade in. You can't. They left a few down at the bottom. You can, if you ever go there, if you've ever been there, you've seen these few. They didn't strip them all off. They stripped them off to build the buildings of Cairo. One of the great rapings of treasures of history that there's been, but nonetheless, at least they left a few so we could see kind of what it looked like. It's gorgeous. And if you go inside them, every
tunnel in there, absolutely perfect. Perfect! Look, this is a seam between stones. No mortar. No mortar. Perfect. The pyramids were Rolex watches built to the size of mountains. That's what they were. Totally impossible for human beings to do that today. And we're supposed to believe that Stone Age people, using fiber ropes and stone tools, did this. Who are they kidding? Themselves. Because they might. The Sphinx, another one. You all heard about the weathering of the stones, which clearly shows that this is caused by water erosion. And the desert of that area, Giza's been dry for at least 8,000 years. So the bare minimum that this could have been carved out to cause this to happen this way would be 10,000 years, and probably it's more like 15,000 years. 15,000 years ago. So right away, this is showing that the Egyptologist thing is completely wrong. And yet, when this came out, when this hit the airwaves in a great documentary called The History of the Sphinx, they just about died. Scientists went nuts that they hadn't been consulted so they could have informed the network that this was completely wrong and had no business being put on the air because it enlightened the great unwashed. Can't have that. I just get so furious at this. Anyway, this is what they did. They cut this out, and they took the stones, and they built two temples in front of the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. All right, if you go there, you'll see them. And you got, here's the Sphinx here, and you got the Sphinx Temple, Valley Temple, and you see the size of the stones again. Pretty doggone big. You got bigger stones, of course, in the inside of the interior, but, still, they're pretty doggone big. Here we see a 170-ton stone in the wall in the Valley Temple. This is back when I had a lot of hair.
Yeah.
It's not me. Somebody else. Anyway, the point is, here you go. 170 tons. It looks bad now because the limestone's been stripped off of it, but it was covered too perfectly. This will move 175 tons. This is what it would take to move that stone you just saw for us today. It would take a couple days to set up and get ready and actually make the lift and put the stone in place. But 175 tons, can do it. That 170-ton stone could have been done by us today. It could have been moved into place. Okay, now look at this Hummer right here. A 1,170-ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan Quarry, a crack rendered into the stone unusable. Now, there are a lot of these around Egypt, these obelisks like this. This isn't the only one, but this is the broken one. So what they were doing is digging it out, and you can see it's pretty well finished, except for this part right here. They were shaping the point of it, and whatever machine was on here, it was this is pink granite. It was just taking it out in chunks, whatever routing machine they had. Certainly not stone tools making this happen. And they pressed too hard, and they cracked it right through here. Just unbuckle the machine, whatever it was, let's just leave it. It's 15 feet in a hole. It's the person taking the pictures up here, you can see the edge. It's in a hole. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, how are you going to move a 1,170-ton obelisk? How are you going to move that? You ain't going to move that. Guess what else you're not going to do? You're not going to cut it loose from its base. There is no saw that would go through that we have no diamond tip saw that would go because the weight would just stop the blade from spinning. Now, how did these primitive people do this? What bozo got the job of getting under there with his stone axe and going to look? Can you see how absurd it is? It's ridiculous. Here's what it would have taken to get 1,000 tons up today. 1,000 tons. Imagine the logistics involved to get that stone up. If you could cut it loose, which we couldn't do. Do you see how absurd it is?
See, this is a much older one, much more worn. 4,500 years, 4,500 years, 2,500 BC. It's VA 243. It's in a museum in Berlin. It's well dated. And it's called the Granting of the Plow. This is a seated God. See him in his chair with a plow in his hand. And this is a standing God, and this is a human. How do we know they're gods? Because they have horns on their helmets. Horns on their helmets. This is how you signify gods, or they did anyway. The Sumerians did on their cylinder seals. Normally they would put astronomical signs up here to indicate who the god was, because not everybody would know. But in this one, obviously everybody knew. This kind of the human is carrying this kind of skunky old digging stick that the most primitive people have, even to this day. And this new wooden plow here, 4,500 years ago, we can go to Egypt today and see this very plow, and in many other third world countries still being used, this very plow. Okay, so no question it's the grinding of the plow. But this is what makes this special right here. What is this? Solar system, right. Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, in their relative sizes, mind you. Earth, Moon, think how small that is. What grain of sand dug that out? Mars, and then, what should be here? This should be the asteroid belt. This is Nibiru, folks. Nibiru. Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Notice that it's only a little bit bigger than Uranus, Neptune. It's about 3 times bigger than Earth. Nibiru is a good-sized planet. Good-sized planet, according to this. Okay? Now, again, what proof do we have of any of this? Let's take a look. Let's take a look at this. All right, here's a look at the solar system that you don't get to very often. And did it occur to any of you that we were looking at a cylinder seal carved at 4,500 years ago that had Uranus in it that we only discovered in 1781 when our telescopes got good enough to see it? It had Neptune when we discovered in 1846 when our telescopes got good enough to see it, and Pluto, which we discovered in 1930 when our mathematicians got good enough to tell our astronomers where to look for the thing because it was so small. What are the Sumerians doing knowing about that? Furthermore, what are they doing writing in one of their tablets that if you look at these two, Uranus and Neptune, in the heavens, meaning right out on them, they look like blue-green watery twins? When we didn't find that out, we thought they were just big old gas bags like Jupiter and Saturn until Voyager went out there in 86 and 89 and found that, lo and behold, they really are blue-green watery twins. What the Sumerians said 4,500 years ago. Furthermore, they didn't count the way we do. Earth was not the third rock from the sun for them. It was number 7. So that means they were counting from out here, and they were putting Pluto in its correct place. What are they doing with all that knowledge? Well, they make no bones about it. They say everything that we know, everything that we are, everything that we have comes from the people living on Nibiru. The people living on Nibiru came to Earth and gave us everything that we have, everything that we know, our great culture. We're brand spanking new. Brand new on this planet. Now, there's still a lot of people, there's still a lot of people that will not accept that. A lot of people that will not accept that. But it is true, and it is becoming more and more acceptable for as outrageous as it is. Now, not only do we know when we were created, we know where. Where? Because the oldest of us consistently kept coming in Southern Africa. And in fact, the cover of Newsweek in 1987 showed that if in fact there was an Adam and Eve, they were black. They would have to have been black. But of course they knew the flack they were going to catch, in the South at least, so they made the blacks look as white as they could. In trying to have it both ways, they caught it coming and going, because you can imagine the letters to the editor after this issue. But the point is, it tells the truth. The oldest of us do come from Southern Africa, and we definitely are 200 to 250,000 years old, and guess what else? That is just what the Sumerians say about us. That the Anunnaki created us around 200 to 250,000 years ago in Southern Africa to dig their gold. What a coincidence. What a coincidence. This whole thing now is described in the great Sumerian epic of creation called the Enuma Elish, which is 6 tablets of action, 1 tablet of summation, which is taken to be by many people the basis for the 6 days of creation and the 1 day of rest. Because much of the Old Testament is a direct come down from the Sumerians. And if you know the Sumerian history, you will see that that is the case. Now, in that great epic of creation, the Enuma Elish, six of the major puzzles of modern astronomy and Earth geology are, I think, plausibly answered. What they say is that in the collision, Nibiru slams into Tiamat. It is a little more held together. It's older, and so it is coalesced more. It holds together. Tiamat is shattered in two, blown apart, torn in half. And that the lighter outer crust, the crust with the water on it, is scattered in all directions. Boom, just an explosion, the lighter crust, and goes off with the water. Now, one of the great mysteries of modern day astronomy is comets. Comets make no sense for this reason. They come from all over the place. In a linear universe, when, the great ball of primordial cloud of dust and gas swirling around flattens out into a pancake to make the solar system, that's the ecliptic. Everything formed in the ecliptic should be in the ecliptic. Nothing should be out of the ecliptic, and yet comets come from all over the place. So they had to be removed out to where they are some kind of way, but we don't have any idea. So they come up with this fantastic thing called the Oort cloud, which is so far away you can't imagine. The Oort cloud is one of the biggest jokes out there. And that's how they explain comets, because they can't explain them any other way. But the problem with comets is they have water in them. And anything out in space is not going to produce water. You produce water by being a cooling planet with lava spewing up the steam and stuff like that, and it condenses, etc. So comets have to begin in a planet. Now, this explains it, I think, plausibly well. Nothing that they will throw at you to explain comets will do it. All right. Number two, the other great mystery, the asteroid belt. What they say is that the inner viscous magma inside Tiamat in the collision was strung out. The bowels of the planet, the guts were ripped out and strung out and broke into little pieces. That's the asteroid belt. They called it the hammered bracelet. We call it the asteroid belt. But there it is. And that's a fairly plausible explanation for it. Again, this doesn't make sense because, as you heard, the exploded planet theory. Problem is, when a planet explodes, it ought to just go boom everywhere. It shouldn't be hanging around. Doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. Okay. Now, the third one is Pluto. Pluto's a problem because it's, as you've all been hearing lately, they're trying to downgrade it. It doesn't belong. It doesn't fit. It has an orbit that's not like the others. It carries inside the orbit of Neptune, and it's 17 degrees off the ecliptic. Again, nothing should be off the ecliptic. What they say is that Nibiru, as it swung around, it pulled Pluto away from Saturn, its original home, and dropped it out where it is now. Now, all astronomers know Pluto is not a natural planet. It started life as a moon of an inner planet. They know that. But they have no idea how it could have gotten moved out to where it is. Here you go. Here's the reasonable answer right here. Now, let's talk about Earth. Three great mysteries here. Life. Well, first of all, let's establish that Earth is a remnant of this. What happens is Nibiru's moon bangs into the remnant of Tiamat, and like pool balls, hitting, knocks it inside the orbit of Mars, and it reestablishes there and becomes the Earth, the remnant of Tiamat. Now, Earth has one great mystery is life. How did life come to be? Life appears, despite what you're told about the lightning bolt into the primordial soup and all that, forget it. That's just a joke. That's just a fantasy fairy tale to tell people that don't want to know the truth and to tell kids in school. That's what they're teaching to this day. We know very well that the first forms of life to appear on Earth appear suddenly. They're very sophisticated bacteria, prokaryotic bacteria, and there's not one, there's two kinds, and they appear at around 4 billion years ago. Suddenly, overnight, strata without, strata with, two kinds of sophisticated bacteria relative to what that first living form would have been. If I had done the first part of my show, you would see all that. The point is, life is a great mystery. How it would suddenly appear 4 billion years ago, here you go. It says in the tablets, in the collision between Nibiru and Tiamat, in the mingling of their waters, Nibiru passed life to Tiamat, to the remnant of Tiamat. Perfect explanation for the sudden appearance of two sophisticated life forms on the remnant. Now, the remnant now is over here with its moon Kingo, and has gone over, and now we're looking at two major differences in Earth and all other astral bodies out there. Earth is missing a huge portion of its crust, and it has plate tectonics, movement in the plates. How could that happen? No explanation. Why? Because in a vacuum, any liquid in a vacuum, what does it do? You see it in the space shuttle all the time. They let orange juice and milk. It makes the smallest, tightest ball it can make. That is what a liquid does in a vacuum. Smallest, tightest ball it can make. Now, that is what all the other astral bodies have done. They don't have plate tectonics. There's nowhere for the plates to go. They're as tight as they can be. Where do plate tectonics come from? In the collision, the backside of Tiamat is cracked like an eggshell. Cracked like an eggshell. There are the plates. There are the plates. And when the missing crust, of course, is when the half is there. It's still viscous. It's still magma. So what's it going to do? It's going to tighten itself down into a new ball, much smaller than the old one had been. And what's going to happen? It's going to have a big chunk gone, a big missing piece of itself, a big hole in itself, in its skin. And so that scar is going to break up into pieces as the plates move around, and we have the plate tectonics and we have the missing surface that we know about today. Next slide, please. And we'll take a look at just a representation of what it looks like with the water gone. Not to scale, of course, but you get the idea. This is not like any other planet or moon out there. Something happened. And I think the Enuma Elish gives a plausible explanation for what that was and for all the other things that I mentioned as well. When the dust settled, here's what we had. The solar system as we know it today, with Nibiru moving in this clockwise 3,600-year orbit, and I say it passes outside the orbit of Mars, inside the inner edge of the asteroid belt, and the last time it went through, I think, was around 200 BC, which means it's just past aphelion out here, and it's going to be back around 3,400 AD, about 1,400 years. We don't have to worry about it if I'm right. You will get arguments about these dates. Some people use textual interpretations. I use the date of the ending of the Ice Age, which I believe was caused by Nibiru passing through and lifting the tides. You can read about why I think that in the book. And I use the dating of the ice cores and the tree rings of science. I try to make my work as scientifically based as I can because I expect someday to be able to go toe-to-toe with those guys, and I want to be able to do it on their turf and their terms. Okay?
So, as far as the information in your book, it's very powerful. And do you think that this is something that we're rediscovering now and relearning about, or do you think that there's an element of society that knows this and is suppressing it? Do you think it's being withheld from us for certain reasons, or do you think we just innocently forgot or got lost or somehow now we're relearning?
That is a very interesting question. I think there's a combination of both at work there. I think most of it was lost in the Great Fire at Alexandria. I think had that material survived to the modern times intact, I think we would know, if not all, at least a lot of these things are the truth. But since we lost all that information, I think that it was forgotten. A lot of it was forgotten. And now I think more than suppression, keeping it from general dissemination, is hubris. And I think it's the hubris of the, quote, experts who are supposed to be on top of these things, but who really don't look beyond their own narrow fields. But if you get thousands of individuals clinging to their tree, you know, every PhD is a PhD with his arms wrapped around his tree in the great scheme of knowledge. And they're so busy learning and holding on to the knowledge of their tree, they really look only maybe one or two or three trees beyond themselves to learn anything. You know, an anthropologist might learn a little bit from a geologist, but in general, you see what I mean? They don't have the time, the inclination, and the encouragement to look beyond their specialty area to try to get a glimpse of the forest, of how it all ties together. So I think that their knowledge of their tree leads them to believe that everything that they hear about everybody else's tree is true, but it's being funneled through a need to conform to what the general consensus of opinion is about how things happen, which is that Darwinism is correct. There was no 10th planet. There is no life outside the Earth, and all of these things that we're talking about in a very matter-of-fact way as being real is totally rejected by the establishment paradigm. So it's the hubris of individuals, men and women, who have been told by others and who constantly are reinforcing to themselves that they're experts and that they know best and that they know everything there is to know about what they're supposed to know about, when in fact the whole history of science is correcting mistakes. That's all science is a forward progression of correcting mistakes. They're constantly wrong, and yet at any moment in time that you pick them out and you say to the experts who are alive at that moment, what do you know about everything? They'll say, we know this and this and this and this and this is absolutely true. And 10 years, 5 years, 15 years from now, everything you're saying is going to be disproved, or most of it is going to be disproved. I mean, Newtonian physics ran for 200 years, and then Einstein came along and upset that. But somebody's going to upset Einstein. We're going to learn to, go into different dimensions and perhaps even time travel. I mean, we're so abysmally ignorant, and we refuse to acknowledge it because our expert's job is to be an expert. And so I think more than a conspiracy of somebody sitting around saying this knowledge has to be squashed is just very, very ignorant, afraid, small inside people who think otherwise about themselves, of course, but who are afraid to stretch, afraid to look out and beyond, and because they've got to protect themselves. And I want to be the first to raise my hand and say that if I was one of them, if I had a wife, if I had children, if I had a mortgage, if I lived a normal life, I would have to protect it with every bit of the zeal that they do. The only reason I can do what I do and say the things that I say is that I have sacrificed a normal life. And it's not just me. It's most of the people in this field that you will talk to. They do not, for the most part, lead normal lives. Or if they do, their lives have been twisted way out of a normal shape in order to do this kind of work. It's very demanding in time and energy and effort. It's not very rewarding in terms of money. And so it takes a very special and very small group of people who do it.
Okay, what happens when a creature is born in the wild severely screwed up physically? What happens to it? Dies, right? Parents will kill it. They will not put that defect into the gene pool. You're looking at the great exception. You're looking at 28 of our most severe genetic defects, but we have 4,000 and counting. 4,000 and counting. Now, we're only 250,000 years old. We shouldn't have one. We've got 4,000 and counting. How did it happen? Cutting and splicing process mistakes. Cutting and splicing, oops, made a mistake. Cutting, splicing, oops, made a mistake. They don't care. They're making a slave. They're not going to fix the mistakes. What do they care if it's 1 in 100 dies from the problems? If it's 1 in 10, they don't care. They're making a mistake. They're making a slave. But they know the numbers, like we have found out the hard way. If you let the population propagate naturally, those numbers go way down for each person. Right now, as we sit here, we average about 50 of the 4,000 each of us. And we have a mating with our mate. If we share any of those 50, then each of our offspring will have a 1 in 4 chance of expressing it. That's why you'll get mongoloids in the best of families, mongoloids in the lowest of families, and all around the world. And that's what genetic defects are. In the wild, you will get 2-headed calves and 6-legged goats. That's a sperm-egg misconnect. That's not something that you see steadily on and on. A little gem like spina bifida, which is not going to let you live to adulthood, nor is it going to let you reproduce if you do. What's that doing in the gene pool? It was all put there, folks. Put there. No question. Okay, here we go with the chromosome match. Comparison, rather. Humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans right here. And you see how similar they are. And as we know that between humans and chimpanzees, there's 99% similarity in the DNA and 98% with gorillas. And it's like, oh, well, then we're just kissing cousins. That's as close as you can be. We're almost the same thing. Well, not really. Because we're talking about a 3 billion base pair genome. 1%, that's 30 million base pairs. That's a couple thousand strands of DNA. If you know what you're doing, that's a lot of change. But also understand that all higher animals, and never say this, share 50% and up. Squirrel, 50% and up. You see, so it isn't quite as astounding as it seems. But what we're looking at here is the Anunnaki have got themselves a real problem. And that problem is this. They come to Earth and they decide they're going to make the slave. They decide we're going to use this creature of Earth, let's say it was an Alma. They test the blood, and what do they find? First thing, big problem, 48 chromosomes. All primates have 48 chromosomes. But they, the Anunnaki, have only 46 chromosomes. How do we know that? Because we have 46 chromosomes. We descend from primates, and yet somehow we lose 2 whole chromosomes. That's an awful lot of DNA. And somehow we're so much better than them. We have 68 or something like that relative to them. But we don't. We have 46. So we know this was the result of the genetic engineering, and they had a problem. The Anunnaki did. What could they do? They had to, you know, how it works. There's 24 in sperm and egg, 23 sperm and egg. So you got to get the sperm and the egg to match up, one or the other, 23 or 24. Can you take out a chromosome from the creature of Earth, the 24, and still have a creature of Earth? No. Can you add a chromosome to yourself and still have an Anunnaki? Go up to 24 from 23? No. You got a real problem. It's an insoluble problem. And you need that because you got to get the first hybrid to get in the game of the genetic engineering. You got to get something alive that is a blending of you two to begin to work on it. So what can you do? How can you solve that problem? There's only one way, and boy, is it smart. You go in and you look and you compare the chromosomes, and you find 2 that can be fused and will take up one space but maintain the integrity of all the chromosomal material. You find a spot where you can fuse 2 to make 1, and now you've got all the material but taking up one place, and now you're ready to rock and roll. You with me? All right, let's look at the number 2 chromosome close up. They just went to the second one. They just looked down the row and they said, okay, this will work. Orangutan, 2 and 3. Gorilla, 2 and 3. Chimp, 2 and 3. Human. Uh-oh. Fusion. How long do you think it would take Mother Nature to do this? There's no clearer proof that we're genetically engineered just like they say we are. And so, I think it's fair to say that everything we know is wrong, at least about human origins, that we were given life by the gods with a small g through the equivalent of a test tube, and that we were the hair-covered hominoids, and that our humanity emerged from that. Now, this is where I normally end it, and they tell me I'm running out of time, so I want to get to the new thing that I want to share with you, because this is really exciting to me. Just recently, I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous, and this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, Dear Mr. Pye, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerian said, and a male person from elsewhere, as I also contend. He goes on to say, what the evolutionists do is find certain genes which look very similar between man and ape, then they make a tree of descent while ignoring those huge impassable abysses of difference elsewhere. Also, by certain methods of DNA dating, one can tell that numerous genes have been recently added to the human genome. If workers in my field were to say such things openly, we would be ostracized.
We're taught today by the Darwinians, or those who espouse the Darwinian theory, that life evolved from an initial pool of water with molecules in it that were basically inorganic, and that some way, sometime, somehow, those inorganic molecules were swept together into a living entity, something that was somehow alive. Now, we know that's not true now, and it's beginning to shift. The teaching is still the same because it takes a while to change the books, but it's becoming acknowledged that life almost had to be delivered to Earth, and the facts are incontrovertible that that's going to be the truth. When life first appears at around 4 billion years ago, the solar system itself is only about 500 million years old, only about 500 million years old. Not really enough time for anything to develop because the Earth was still basically a seething ball of magma then. Very little land had actually cooled out, very little water would be available for anything to form in. The Darwin's warm pool, warm pond, couldn't possibly have existed when life first came. Not only did life come suddenly, at a time when it's just inexplicable that would happen, it came in not one form, but in 2 forms. Prokaryotic bacteria, there are 2 kinds. For a long time, it was thought that there was just one kind, but there are actually 2. So you have suddenly, at around 4 billion years ago, 2 distinct, separate kinds of prokaryotic bacteria appear on Earth as the first life forms. And those life forms were so complex and so complicated, even though they didn't have the nucleus of the eukaryotic bacteria, which came later, much later. Even though they didn't have cell nucleus, they're functioning to this day, because we have them to this day. Their functioning is so complex, so chemically complex, there's no doubt that it couldn't possibly have developed here. It had to have been delivered here, and it had to be delivered whole and intact, and it had to come at about 4 billion years ago. So given those facts right out of the box, there is no Darwinian development at the first stage of life as we understand it. Then as you move along through the history, Darwin postulated that from that beginning, however that beginning occurred, and he was no more clear on it than we were until just recently, however that beginning occurred, it had to develop very slowly but very regularly toward more and more complex beings, more creatures, however you care to term that. And as that slow gradual progression developed, ever more sophistication was put into the system by what he called natural selection, which is little traits that would somehow help a creature improve its odds of reproducing itself, would make for more and more and more sophisticated beings and creatures. And that's how we supposedly evolved, a word Darwin didn't use but which became popular later. We evolved from those bacteria through millions and millions and millions of slight improvements to creatures that were intermediate, the intermediate forms. And when Darwin put forth his theory in 1869, he said very clearly, if the intermediate forms that I'm postulating cannot be found, then my theory is wrong. He knew that there was a problem, because even in his day it was clear in the fossil record that there were these huge gaps, and then things would just suddenly appear. So he said, now that we know to look for them, we should find these intermediate species. We haven't found any really to this point. We do find development within species. We do find changes at the micro level, which is changes in parts. Darwin himself found the changes in the beaks of the finches, Darwin's finches, the shells of the tortoises that he found on the Galapagos. So he found indications of change at the micro level, at the part level. And what he postulated, what he extrapolated is, well, if we can see obvious change at the micro level, then we can legitimately assume that change also is going to occur at the macro level, at the whole body level, so that it will be possible for one species to change into, over time, another species entirely. And that was the bedrock of his theory. And again, he said, but if you can't find any transitional species where it's clear that one thing is turning into something else, or that thing is turning into something else yet again, there will be a problem. And that's been the result of much more detailed analysis of the fossil record. There are no intermediate species. Now, once scientists began to understand that and realize that what you saw was long periods of life existing in what is called stasis, which means the same. It basically stays the same. In the fossil record, you have these long periods of stasis followed by these periods of catastrophe where everything is just gone. It's wiped out. Not everything, but most everything. And then you have these periods of not much happening, and then suddenly the niches get filled up again very rapidly, these explosions of life forms. So when science in the 50s and 60s began to see what the reality of the situation was and how far it was from classic Darwinism, which they were already very heavily bought into because that's what they used to maintain the moral high ground against the creationists, they knew they had a problem. So Stephen Gould and some others came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that as life develops, there are catastrophes that wipe them out. It's pretty clear from the fossil record that these happen. There's been 5 major ones and several minor ones. In the major ones, you had wipeouts of life forms anywhere from 50% to 80%, 90% of all life forms wiped out. The first big one, the Permian, wiped out about 90% of the life forms that existed at that time. And yet, after this happens, the ecological niches are filled with new species that are suited to the new environment, whatever it is. So you have the catastrophe that changes everything, changes the atmosphere and changes the earth. Some things survive because they are adapted or are able to adapt themselves to the new environment. But then new species come in that are adapted to whatever that new environment is each time. Now, how does that happen? How can that happen? How can they rapidly fill in within a few thousand years all of the niches? Can evolution do that? No. There's no record. You would have to see it.
So you're suggesting there was, an exterior factor that used genetic manipulation or genetic engineering, and you mentioned that this is a recorded history, ancient recorded history of the Sumerians. So who are the Sumerians? What did they have to say? How did they record this?
The people who the Sumerians say came to Earth to do the genetic engineering that we've talked about are the Anunnaki. Right now, the Sumerians are considered to be the first great culture in the history of Earth as we understand it and accept it now. They seem to have come out of the Stone Age at around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. And they seem to have come out of the Stone Age and miraculously, virtually overnight, with no precedents whatever, created a very high civilization. In fact, they came up with over 100 of the firsts that we consider high culture. They had the first writing, the first language, the first cities, the first roads, the first laws, the first libraries, the first schools, the first music, the first literature, right on down the line. So they had the first of everything, basically, that counts. So how do you come out of the Stone Age and produce this miraculously advanced culture? How do you come down out of the highlands of the Crescent Valley, the Fertile Crescent rather, and settle into this valley, the valley of modern day Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is where the Sumerian culture arose, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley of ancient times in modern day Iraq, and build this sophisticated culture with no base under you whatsoever? It absolutely defies belief. It boggles the mind. It shouldn't be. So what happens is historians, though they are very aware of it, tend to sort of leave them in the past and deal with the beginnings of history and culture with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the later Romans. That's sort of the sequence: Egyptians, Greeks, Romans. The Sumerians are very seldom talked about, very seldom dealt with, even though we have a tremendous amount of knowledge about them, because one of the things they developed first was writing, and one of the things that they stored that writing in was libraries. And their writing was done on clay tablets that were soft clay, and they used a stylus to write in what's called cuneiform, and then those would be fired in kilns, which is another invention of theirs, to turn it into stone. So they're very durable. So we have over 100,000 of these tablets have been recovered, most of which deal with the minutiae of everyday life, business deals, business transactions. Only about 5,000, as I understand it, dealing with the history of the culture and their literature and things like that. But of those 5,000 some odd tablets that we have, they tell an incredible story, the Sumerians do, of the Anunnaki, which is that there's another planet in our solar system, that gods, super beings, live on this planet, that these beings come to Earth for the specific reason of mining gold, which they need to repair their atmosphere on their planet, in the same way that we are damaging and destroying our own planet in our rise to a high civilization. Apparently the Anunnaki did the same thing on their planet. In their rise to a high civilization, they damaged their atmosphere, and they needed to replace it. Now, when our turn comes to repair our atmosphere, if we're not too late, the way we will almost certainly have to do it is to take gold, ironically enough, as finely as we can grind it up into pieces that are just infinitely small, so that they'll float above the atmosphere, and shoot them up into space and put them up there and let them disperse, because gold is a great reflector of cosmic rays. And it's, of course, an insulator, but that's why you see gold sheathing on the visors of astronauts, and why gold is in the satellite, in the capsules, the space capsules, to shield from cosmic rays. So that's what the Anunnaki said they had to do. Now, it's amazing to me that here are the Sumerians writing 4,000 years ago, saying these things that we are only just now beginning to realize ourselves we're going to have to do one day. So for whatever it's worth, they say the Sumerians say that the Anunnaki said they came to Earth to get the gold, and they did that. So they were here. They came at around 400,000 years ago, and they lived here for quite some time, just simply panning gold out of the rivers. It's called placer mining. And placer mining is the way we mine today, when we can. It's the easiest way to do it. But over time, everything taps out. So when the Tigris-Euphrates Valley tapped out, they had to move elsewhere. And so they, by then, because they were a flying civilization, they had found the mother lode in southern Africa. To this day, the mother lode of gold on Earth is South Africa. So they divided themselves up. They left half of themselves, and there were only about 600 of them at maximum, because they had to shuttle in from their planet, Nibiru. And so their 600 they divided up. Some stayed in the home base, the original home base, the Eden, and the other group moved down to the underworld, the lower world, which was southern Africa, to do the mining. And they didn't like to mine. It was hard work. It wasn't like just putting trays in water and collecting the gold out every 2-3 weeks. They had to dig it out. They didn't like doing it, so they revolted. And they said, the Anunnaki did, to their leaders, we don't want to do this anymore. So the leader said, all right, we'll make you a slave. We'll make you a servant. And that's the reason, the impetus, according again to the Sumerian writings, for the creation of human beings. To me, this makes perfect sense. If I was a superior being from another planet and I came to Earth, or anywhere, and I suddenly found myself having to do extremely difficult work, and there was another being that could be somehow genetically manipulated to turn into a slave and a servant, I would do it. And I think that they did. And I think it matches the genetic evidence that we have of what happened to us. I think the reasoning is logical. It makes sense. It may not be true. It could turn out to not be true. But why would the Sumerians leave anything even hinting at these things? Where would they get that kind of... You couldn't have that creativity at that period of time, because space travel wouldn't even be an option to them. They wouldn't even think of it. Flying. Maybe not even gold mining. I mean, these are people that are just scratching for a living, supposedly. And then suddenly they're developing this culture, and they're digging gold and do all of it. It doesn't make sense. So I in the absence of any evidence that's compelling to the contrary, I consider the Sumerian tablets to be extremely compelling. But because it so challenges the standard accepted theories of human origins, the Darwinian theory, when scholars deal with that information, they simply ignore it. They just put it off into what they call the myth pile. They just say, that has to be myth because it can't be true. And if it can't be true, there's myth and there's truth. Not truth, got to be myth. And so it's just simply discarded information. By going into that myth pile and looking at it and treating it as real and formulating a whole scenario that explains, I think, in much more accurate terms, for whatever degree they might be wrong, they are infinitely more accurate and factual than is the Darwinian theory of our evolution. That's absolute garbage. That is just total junk, and will be recognized as such in the not too distant future as we keep opening up our genes, and it begins to face us more and more that we are we're created. Then we're going to start looking for, well, who would have created us? And the answer's been sitting there all along for 4,000 years. It's just that the establishment doesn't want to look at the truth right now. But it's my job and the job of people like me to get this word out, and we're going to be standing on the right side when this is over. There is going to be a reckoning one day, and the truth is going to come out. And this is going to be infinitely closer to the truth, if not exactly the truth in all of its points. It's much closer to the truth than what we're taught right now, for sure.
There are many things that we are taught to believe that are wrong. One of those is genetics. The human body contains 100 trillion cells. Each cell contains a nucleus, except the red blood cells. Each nucleus contains 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. One chromosome of every pair is from each parent. The chromosomes are filled with tightly coiled strands of DNA. Genes are segments of DNA that contain instructions to make proteins, the building blocks of life. Apart from sperm, eggs, and red blood cells, every cell in our bodies carries our entire genetic package. It is mind-bogglingly small, with all the chromosomes, 23 from each parent, inside each cell's nucleus. This complete genetic package is called nuclear DNA. Outside the nucleus of each cell, floating in the cytoplasm, tiny organelles called mitochondria contain even more DNA, called mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA contains only a very small amount of genetic material, and all of that is inherited entirely from females. Scientists are able to manipulate genes through a process known as gene splicing. They use chemical scissors to cut gene segments away from where they belong in the DNA strand, and then use other chemicals to insert or splice those living, working segments anywhere else in the gene strand. The possibilities for altering an organism are endless, as are the possibilities for making mistakes. Human DNA carries an improbable number of defects, over 4,000 compared to just a few hundred in chimps and gorillas. Of these 4,000 plus defects in the human genome, more than 24 will kill you before you reach the age of puberty. While it is possible for a deadly genetic defect to not be expressed and to just move passively from parent to child, imagine the odds that this would happen often enough to spread this unique type of defect through the entire human population. Impossible might be too strong a word, but it is staggeringly improbable that this would happen naturally. There must be a more rational solution. Remember the ability to splice genes and the huge potential for error. What if something like that happened to humans to create our genetic defects? Would evidence be left behind? Amazingly, that is exactly what research has uncovered. Evidence of gene segments that have been cut, flipped, and then reinserted upside down back into the genome. And that is just the beginning. This shows the chromosome lineup for humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. Notice the remarkable similarity in much of their banding arrays. However, humans carry only 46 chromosomes, while all of the other higher primates, supposedly the creatures we evolved from, carry 48. This is not a transition from one step to another. This is a transformation. How could we evolve into a creature with 2 whole fewer chromosomes and vastly more genetic defects? How could humans be so much better than chimps with 2 entire chromosomes missing? Remarkably, the 2 missing chromosomes aren't missing at all. In humans, what would be the 2nd and 3rd chromosomes in a higher primate have been carefully and deliberately fused into one single chromosome. Of course, mainstream scientists explain this as a natural mutation that just happened to occur at some point in our evolution. However, the truth is that fusions like this are only seen in labs, where geneticists leave exactly the same kind of telltale evidence in the genes they manipulate. Occam's razor is a scientific principle that says the simplest answer is usually the correct one. At this time, the only rational, simple explanation for how human genes came to look like they were genetically manipulated is that they were genetically manipulated. The smoking gun so obvious in our DNA is not the only evidence for manipulation. Most humans currently accept Darwin's theory of evolution that humans gradually evolved from primates. Let's forget for a moment that the human genome contains those 4,000 plus errors, something extremely unlikely to have evolved by a process of natural selection, and focus on a positive difference between humans and primates. The cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface of the brain, an area strongly linked to intelligence. A rat's cerebral cortex, flattened out, would cover a postage stamp, a monkey's a postcard, a chimp's a page of typing paper. But a human's covers the equivalent of 4 pages of paper. In 1987, new research into the mitochondrial Eve theory proved that humans, as we are today, came into existence rather suddenly at only about 200,000 years ago. To have somehow developed 4 times the cerebral cortex in such a short time period is an extremely dramatic and sudden difference which, like the genetic defects and evidence of gene splicing, cannot be explained by a slow and selective process of evolution. Occam's razor would require that, if the evidence shows it is almost impossible for humans to have naturally evolved, and if there is evidence of genetic manipulation, then humans probably are the products of genetic manipulation rather than evolution. And yet science still refuses to undertake a serious investigation of this simple and logical answer. Instead, they have invented a new convoluted explanation to try to make sense of it all, the genetic bottleneck theory. A genetic bottleneck is caused when most of a species dies out for one reason or another, leaving only a few breeding pairs to begin regenerating the species. The stress of this supposedly causes an explosion of extreme Darwinian evolution, which accounts for the transformation that occurred to make humans what they are. There is no actual evidence for this extreme evolution ever having occurred with humans, or for any sort of near extinction event which might have caused it. But it is the only theory science has proposed to explain how a species only 200,000 years old could have advanced so much compared to other species like chimps or gorillas, which seem not to have changed at all in that same time period. When explained by someone in a lab coat using scientific jargon, the bottleneck theory may sound plausible, but when you consider all of the events that need to happen to make the theory work, and the fact that no evidence exists to support any of them, it simply doesn't make sense. Human genes show evidence of genetic manipulation. Human brains show evidence that humans suddenly transformed rather than gradually evolved. Human mitochondrial DNA suggests that the modern human species came into being 200,000 years ago, which rules out gradual mutation, leaving no plausible natural explanation for humans being as advanced as they are. The logical answer is that humans didn't actually evolve on Earth. They were genetically created to live here, and our genes prove it.